Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we turn our attention across the pond and around the world as we welcome Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow, Reverend Dr. Becca Edwards, to the program. Becca just returned from the Conference of the Parties, the Global Climate Talks in Baku, Azerbaijan. She'll talk to us about the priorities being discussed on the world climate stage and what people of faith in our own communities can do. Becca will talk to us about concerns over the federal climate response over the next few years. But climate is like many other issues, where we can make substantive progress even when positive federal policy outcomes seem less likely. We have steps we can take at the state level, the local level, and even in our own congregations and communities. Keep an eye on our website at texasimpact.org for ways that you can get involved or join our climate action team to connect with advocates from throughout the state who care about these issues. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow, Becca Edwards. Joining us for today's conversation is Reverend Dr. Becca Edwards, Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow. Becca, it's been a long few weeks for you. How you feeling today?
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me. I'm feeling better than I was the last couple of days for sure. I was pretty tired, but I've been getting a couple good nights sleep in a row, and I think I'm getting back on track.
For a good reason. And for folks who don't know what we're talking about, Becca just returned from the 29th Conference of the Parties in Baku, Azerbaijan. Becca, how was the trip?
Oh, the trip was great. It's always so great to visit a new part of the world and see how people live. We stayed in a residential part of Baku and got to know the neighborhood, got to see some of the same people, get to know some of the same coffee shops and restaurants, got to know some of the neighborhood cats, which was kind of a fun part of the experience. And it's just always fun to travel with the climate community. On our way back from Baku on my first flight, the one from Baku to Frankfurt, I actually sat next to somebody from the Department of Labor who had been involved in some of the negotiations around a just transition away from fossil fuels. So fascinating opportunity for discussion even on the flight home.
Yeah, we jumped right in. Longtime listeners will have heard us talk about COP before in the past. But talk to us about the COP. What is it? Why is it important?
So COP is, like you said, the Conference of the Parties, and it's the annual gathering of the signatories to the original United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so these countries gather every year to discuss the progress they've made on climate action, including climate mitigation, which means reducing fossil fuel emissions, as well as adaptation. So how well are they adjusting to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing? So these countries gather every year to negotiate. Each COP has a slightly different focus. This year's COP focused on climate finance primarily through a mechanism called the New Collective Quantified Goal. And really, it's just trying to figure out the best amount of money that we should collect to distribute to developing countries to support their adaptation and mitigation activities.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different tracks that you could follow at the COP. It's a giant ordeal. But talk to us about the issues that you specifically focused on this year.
Sure. So my focus this year was climate finance, as I mentioned, as well as following science and energy topics. So real similar to the things I follow here at home and on the federal level. In addition to the formal negotiation process, there's lots of opportunities to meet up with other folks that are talking about issues like how is NOAA responding to the climate crisis? How is FEMA preparing communities for climate impacts so that they are better able to withstand climate-related disasters? So like I said, beyond the negotiations, there were plenty of opportunities to engage on some of my favorite topics like science and meteorology and energy.
Love that for you. You do cover a lot. Your portfolio covers energy and climate policy from the state level all the way up through the international level. I know on this program we've talked about local actions that folks can take as well. How do all of those different levels work together, and what's the benefit of the holistic view you get with such a big portfolio?
Sure. So it's a challenge for sure, but there are lots of benefits. So each level has its role. So this international level that I was just a part of at COP, their role is to set goals and targets and to coordinate the international community in their climate actions. And then the federal level, they take those decisions and those targets and goals set at the international level and turn them into policy that's relevant to our specific context in the U.S. Then each state is responsible for taking the federal policy that's made and implementing it locally. So, for example, at COP, I went to a session on methane. So every country that was gathered talked about the mitigation activities they have taken part in and the ones they plan for the future on methane mitigations. And then at the meeting, the U.S. announced the finalization of the waste emission charge, which is a federal program to institute a fee for industrial actors who emit more methane than is allowed. And so that's the federal connection. And then this afternoon, I was just on a call to talk more about how Texas is going to implement the state implementation plan for the new methane rule, which is another federal program. So all of those levels are important. They all inform one another, and they all work together to implement this really important environmental policy.
What was one big challenge from this year?
I would say one challenge for this year is that I think the whole international community is sort of nervous about how the U.S. will move forward given the change in administration to an administration that historically has not been prioritizing climate action. So we have made some significant progress over the years, and I think people are wondering what's to come. And so that was a question that our delegation got quite a bit, and I was happy to be able to talk about all of the different programs that are ongoing at different levels of government, like I said, so the state levels and the city level governments that are doing some really great work on climate. So there's a program called America is All In that coordinates and sort of quantifies these efforts. And the cities that have signed the America is All In pledge, which means they will continue to work on climate action in spite of any change in federal priorities. They represent actually 55% of the population and 65% of our GDP. So despite what might change at the federal level, I'm confident that climate action in the U.S. is going to be alive and well for the foreseeable future.
And I think that word of hope is important, right? Because it certainly would be a lot easier if the federal government was a partner in this. But there's so much work going on outside of what's happening at the federal level. So I love that you gave us some hope there. Anything else from this year that gave you hope?
So I guess, as always, just knowing and meeting and interacting with the people that are working on this. There's so many committed advocates, committed civil servants that are deeply invested in climate action, and the work that they do is creative and inspired and effective and collaborative. And so I think one of the things that from an outsider's perspective can be really intimidating like this. It's a lot easier if you're on this level where you're meeting the individual people who are working on it and having the conversations in these spaces like COP. It gives me a lot of hope just to know and see the faces and hear the stories of the people who are doing this work.
Speaking of people who are doing this work, I'm going to make you put the Reverend part of your Dr. Reverend title to work here. You were part of a coalition, a group of faith leaders from throughout the world who were advocating and doing this work at the COP. Talk about that experience being with other people of faith and maybe speak to why it's so important that the faith community specifically engages. So
the faith community, sort of start at the very basic level. Martin Luther King said that the church is the conscience of the state. And that's one role that I see the faith community playing in advocacy of all kinds, but certainly in the conversation around climate change. So I was told that one of my roles was to be a faithful witness. So just be there, witnessing what's going on and sort of providing feedback and accountability for the process. Another role that the faith community plays is to keep the focus on the impacts on people, right? So we are concerned about the people more than the economy. How are climate impacts affecting individuals and communities that are affected? One of the things the faith community does really well is it's a keeper of stories. We have work and we have mission and we have missionaries that are serving all over the world. And their stories of how climate change is having an impact on local communities are so powerful and motivating. And I think that's not something that you would have access to without those networks that faith communities provide. So being part of the faith community, the advocacy community of faith people is just a gift. It really is. And especially in these really challenging spaces, to be alongside some of these really hardworking advocates is such a great part of the experience.
And there are a lot of people of faith who are listening, who are following your work back home. What do you hope they do? What do you hope people here in Texas, throughout the United States, throughout the world will do coming out of the COP?
So, as always, one of the best things a person of faith can do on climate is to learn as much as you can, to talk about it with each other, to talk about it with your clergy people and the people in your spheres of influence. I think this has been kind of a tough issue because some faith communities have characterized this as an issue that's outside of our faith. But I can think of lots of connections between our faith and our climate advocacy. So just talking about it and sort of destigmatizing, having that conversation would be a really good place to start.
All right. I'm going to ask you about food in a second, which is one of my favorite topics. But any other closing thoughts from the COP? Any homework or closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
You're putting me on the spot here, Scott.
I know I'm tricky. I'm hard like that.
That's okay. I would say just keep an eye on what comes out of COP. I know it can be kind of a hard meeting to follow. There's just either way too much information or not enough. The negotiations are ongoing. There have been some challenging moments, but if as a people of faith, if we can stay informed on this topic and stay active with our elected officials, we can do a really good service to this conversation.
And I'm sure we'll have some wrap-up information at texasimpact.org, so keep an eye on the website. Check out all of Becca's blogs. Join her team. Do all of those things. Becca, I do know that you want to speak about the food. Talk to us about any favorite foods from the region.
Yeah, so one of the fun things about this trip is that we got to travel with Texas Impact's very own Russia expert, Bobby Watson. And so he recommended lots of good things for us to try. There was a restaurant that was not far from our apartment where they served a dish called hachapuri, which is sort of a bread bowl filled with cheese. And then when they bring it out of the oven, they crack an egg into the middle of it. And then you stir it up and you dip the bread in it and eat it. And it was absolutely delicious. We went there a couple of times. The other thing that we really enjoyed was the pomegranate beef, which is not something I expected, but it was absolutely delicious.
I saved that question for the end because I feel like I need to go get a snack now. I'm hungry, so I didn't want to do that too early in the program. Anyway, Becca, really appreciate the time. Have loved following you on social media as you've had some great adventures on this trip and look forward to seeing the wrap up in the days to come. We appreciate you. Thanks for the time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Becca, and I hope you'll continue to follow along with news from the COP and consider ways that you can get involved. If you liked what you heard from Becca, consider joining her and other advocates in the Climate Action Team to take action year-round. The Texas legislative session is coming soon, so make sure you sign up for all of the Texas Impact teams that are interesting to you and check out opportunities in the Action Center at texasimpact.org. Texans of Faith will be an important component in the work for justice and equity during the 140-day Texas legislative session that kicks off in January. We're going to need each of you. So check out the tools and resources for your civic engagement and advocacy work at texasimpact.org. While you're there, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions about any of it, please reach out. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.